The desert was merciless that night, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest, broken only by the distant cry of coyotes and the slow groan of the wind dragging sand across the barren earth. Malachi Brooks rode alone, as he had for most of his years, his horse's hooves leaving a trail that the shifting dust would erase within minutes. A man like him didn't leave tracks for long, not in this country, and not in the life he led. He wasn't looking for company. He never was. Yet fate often found loners when they least expected it. The moon hung pale above the jagged ridges, spilling just enough light to reveal a dark shape at the edge of a dried-up creek bed. Malachi pulled the reins, his instincts sharper than most men's, sharpened by years of trouble and too much blood spilled across this land. His hand went to the revolver at his side, not out of malice, but survival. In the desert, most shadows had teeth, but this one was different. As he dismounted, the outline took shape small, frail, trembling. A child. A girl no older than 12, her dress torn and caked with dust, her lips cracked from thirst. She lay half in the dry creek bed, as if the earth itself had tried to swallow her. Malachi knelt, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, finding a faint, fluttering heartbeat. The girl stirred, her eyes barely opening. A language she did not know slipped from her mouth in broken whispers Apache. Malachi understood none of the words, but he understood desperation. He understood the way she clawed weakly at the air, her body begging for what her lips couldn't form. Water. His canteen was nearly empty. He hadn't planned on sharing it with anyone, but plans didn't matter now. He tilted it to her lips, and she drank in ragged gulps, like a soul clinging to life. He stopped her before she drained the last drop, but the relief in her eyes was enough to knot something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Easy now," he murmured, though she couldn't understand him. "You'll make it." She coughed, shuddered, then sagged against his arm. Malachi looked out across the moonlit desert, a stretch of endless horizon that promised no help, no comfort. Whoever she was, she hadn't gotten here alone. Someone had abandoned her, or worse, someone had been chasing her. And now, by pulling her from death's hand, Malachi Brooks had stepped into the kind of trouble a loner like him had spent his whole life trying to avoid. He laid her gently across his horse and started walking beside them, his boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't know where her people were, didn't know if they'd come looking for her, or if they'd see him as a thief who had taken what wasn't his. But leaving her behind wasn't an option anymore. By the time he reached the old shack he called home, the sky was already paling at the edges. The girl was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. He carried her inside, laying her on his cot, the only decent thing he owned. He lit the lantern, its warm glow casting shadows across the rough-hewn walls. For the first time, he studied her closely, Apache features, but softer her cheeks still round with youth, though hardship had carved lines far too early. A necklace hung around her neck, leather-bound with a carved bone pendant that looked worn from years of touch. Malachi knew enough to recognize it wasn't just jewelry, it was something sacred, something that marked her as belonging. And that meant she wasn't just a child lost in the desert, she was someone's daughter, someone's blood. He poured the last of his water into a tin cup, setting it by her side. Then he sat back against the wall, his revolver within reach, his eyes never leaving her. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant howl of coyotes. But beneath it, Malachi thought he heard something else, the faint rhythmic thrum of hooves far out on the horizon. By dawn, the girl stirred again, her eyes opening wider this time. She whispered something he couldn't understand, but her gaze darted to the window, then back to him. Fear, recognition, a warning in her young eyes. Malachi pushed to his feet and stepped outside. The rising sun burned the desert gold, and with it came the sight that made his gut tighten. Riders. At first, only a few dark silhouettes cresting the far ridge, but as the minutes passed, they multiplied. Lines of them, stretching across the horizon, their horses moving with silent precision. Not 10, not 50, closer to 500. Warriors, Apache, the girl's people. and they were riding straight for him. Malachi's hand went to his gun out of habit, but he knew a weapon meant nothing against that many. 500 warriors could flatten a town, let alone a single man's shack in the desert. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand tall as the thunder of hooves grew louder, the ground trembling beneath his boots. The girl's rescue had not gone unnoticed, and now, at sunrise, the desert had come alive with the weight of an entire people moving as one. Malachi Brooks had fed a child life with a swallow of water, and at dawn, 500 Apache riders arrived in silence to decide what price he would pay for it. The ground shook as the riders came. Dust rose in waves, blotting out the edges of the horizon until the desert itself seemed alive, a living, breathing force bearing down on a lone rancher's shack. Malachi Brooks stood outside, his hand resting near his revolver, though he knew it wouldn't save him. The sheer number of riders was enough to make the air feel heavy, a wall of hooves and silence pressing against his chest. Not a word was spoken, not a war cry, not a shout. Just 500 pairs of eyes narrowing as the line drew closer, slowing to a measured trot until the first rank stopped 20 yards from his door. The rest fanned out in a semicircle, horses stamping, nostrils flaring, the riders' spears and rifles catching the morning light. Malachi had faced his share of danger in the West: bandits, drifters, lawmen with more greed than justice in their hearts, but nothing compared to this. The Apache were not a mob of reckless men. They were disciplined, united, bound by something deeper than fear. He could feel it in their silence, in the way they all moved like parts of the same storm. From among them, one rider dismounted. An older man, his hair streaked with gray, his face carved with lines of wisdom and grief. His buckskin coat was decorated with beadwork, his presence commanding without a single word. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood just a few paces from Malachi. Behind Malachi, inside the shack, the girl stirred and coughed weakly. The old man's eyes flicked to the sound, then back to Malachi, hard as stone. "You found her," the man said at last. His English was broken but strong, carrying the weight of authority. Malachi hesitated, then nodded once. "Found her near the creek bed. She was dying." The old man studied him in silence, his expression giving nothing away. He turned slightly, raising his hand. The riders behind him shifted, and for the first time, a murmur rippled through the mass. The name Ahioka passed from mouth to mouth, carried like a prayer, like a lifeline. Malachi looked back toward the shack. The girl Ahioka had pushed herself upright, leaning heavily against the wall, her eyes wide and wet. She saw the old man and whispered a word that cracked with emotion. "Shiche, father?" The old man's jaw tightened. He moved past Malachi and into the shack without hesitation. Malachi followed, though every instinct told him to keep distance from a man who could bring 500 warriors to his doorstep with a gesture. Inside, the father knelt beside the girl, brushing her tangled hair back from her face. Their words, soft and rapid in Apache, filled the room like the low hum of a song Malachi couldn't understand, but felt deep in his chest. The girl clung to her father's hand, weak but alive. Finally, the old man rose, turning back to Malachi. "You gave her water," he said simply. Malachi shrugged, though his throat was dry. Seemed the right thing to do. The old man studied him again. Many men would pass. Many men would let her die. His gaze hardened. "You are not many men." Malachi had no answer. He wasn't sure what he was. The father stepped outside again, raising his hand once more. This time the riders dismounted, moving as one, and began unloading bundles from their horses. Blankets, food, clay jars of water, even weapons, rifles and bows, laid carefully on the ground in front of Malachi's shack. Malachi's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" The old man's voice was steady. "Gifts. For a life. For her." Malachi shook his head. "I didn't do it for—" But the old man cut him off with a sharp look. "It does not matter. When one saves blood, all blood remembers." He gestured to the horizon, where more riders were still appearing, their silhouettes dark against the rising Sunday. "Our people do not forget." The sheer weight of it all hit Malachi then, not just the riders before him, but the history riding on their shoulders. To them, saving the girl wasn't a simple act of mercy. It was a bond, a chain forged in the dust and sealed in the heartbeat of a child who should have been lost but wasn't. And bonds with a people like this were not broken easily. As the gifts piled higher, Malachi felt unease coil in his chest. He had lived his life avoiding ties, avoiding debts, avoiding anything that could anchor him to a cause that wasn't his own. Yet here he was, staring at 500 riders who now saw him as part of something far larger than his solitary shack in the desert. The girl's father approached him once more. "You will be protected," he said firmly. "Any man who comes for you, comes for us." Malachi almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't need protection." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Every man needs protection, even one who does not ask." The words hung heavy between them. Malachi knew the truth in them, even if he didn't want to admit it. Out here, a man's life could be ended by a stray bullet, a desperate thief, a thirst he couldn't quench. Protection was rare and costly. The riders settled around his land, a quiet encampment forming as the sun climbed higher. Fires were lit, food prepared, the smell of roasting meat drifting across the desert air. Children ran between the horses, laughter carrying where only silence had reigned before. Malachi stood at the edge of it all, feeling like a ghost in his own home. What had started as a simple act giving water to a child had turned his shack into the center of a gathering that could shift the balance of the entire frontier. And deep down, Malachi knew this wasn't just gratitude. It was preparation. These people hadn't come only to give thanks. They had come because something was stirring in the land, something that demanded 500 riders ride together at dawn. Malachi lit a cigarette, staring at the horizon. The West had a way of swallowing men whole. He had spent years keeping his distance, surviving by staying invisible. But now, with 500 warriors camped on his doorstep, invisibility was no longer an option. And as the smoke curled into the rising sun, Malachi Brooks felt the weight of a choice pressing in on him. Walk away and leave this bond behind, or accept that by saving one girl in the desert, he had tied himself to an entire nation. The horizon was no longer empty. It was filled, and with it came a storm he couldn't yet name. The desert night came alive with firelight. From Malachi's porch, he could see the glow of dozens of campfires dotting the landscape, their smoke rising into a sky heavy with stars. The riders had settled in silence, yet their presence was anything but quiet. 500 warriors resting on his land was like sleeping at the edge of a thunderstorm one spark, and the sky would split open. Malachi sat on the porch rail, a half-burnt cigarette dangling between his fingers. The girl, Ahioka, slept inside, her breathing even for the first time since he'd found her. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the old itch crawling up his spine, the itch that told him trouble was closing in. The same itch that had kept him alive this long. A shadow moved at the edge of the camp. Not Apache. Not one of Cain's men either. This shadow moved alone, like a coyote circling for scraps. Malachi narrowed his eyes. By instinct, his hand went to the revolver at his side. He didn't draw, not yet. He just watched. The figure drew closer, slipping between the glow of campfires until finally stepping into the open. A young man, maybe 20, his clothes ragged, his face sharp with hunger and anger both. He raised his hands slowly, as if approaching judgment. The Apache nearest to him bristled, but the old man, Ahioka's father, spoke a command that stilled them. The young man looked past all of them and fixed his eyes on Malachi. "You're Malachi Brooks?" Malachi flicked ash off his cigarette. "Depends who's asking." The boy's jaw clenched. "My name's Jonah Blackwood." The name landed like a stone. Malachi ground out his cigarette. "Blackwood?" The boy nodded sharply. "Harrison Blackwood was my uncle. And you're the man hiding the woman who killed him." A ripple ran through the camp. The Apache didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Warriors gripped weapons, tension rising like dry brush catching flame. Malachi stood slowly, his hand brushing the wood of the porch rail. "Careful with your words, boy. You don't know the whole story." Jonah spat in the dirt. "I know enough. She ran from justice. And now you've got half the desert ready to go to war just to protect her. My family's name won't be dragged through the mud by some rancher who thinks he can play hero." The old man stepped forward, his face carved in shadow. "He saved my daughter. His debt is ours." Jonah sneered. "Debt? What about mine? My uncle's blood cries out, and I'll see it answered." He pulled a pistol from under his coat, quick and desperate. But he didn't know the way of the gun like Malachi did. Malachi's revolver cleared leather before Jonah's hammer even cocked. One shot split the night. Jonah's weapon clattered into the dirt. The boy froze, staring at his bleeding hand. Malachi had taken a finger, nothing more. Enough to stop him, enough to humiliate him. "Go home," Malachi said flatly, "before you get yourself buried out here." But Jonah didn't leave. His eyes, wet with pain and pride, burned into Malachi's soul. "You'll regret this," he hissed, clutching his ruined hand. "You've made yourself an enemy of the Blackwood name. My uncle may be dead, but the men who backed him aren't, and they'll come with more than 500 riders. They'll come with lawmen, judges, guns for hire. And when they do, all these people you think you've saved will be slaughtered for your mistake." He staggered back, cradling his wound, and slipped into the dark. Malachi didn't chase him. He just stood, revolver heavy in his hand, while the Apache whispered among themselves. The old man's voice broke the silence. "He speaks lies to frighten you." Malachi holstered his weapon. "No, he speaks truth. That boy just lit a fuse, and it's only a matter of time before the fire reaches us." The old man nodded slowly. "Then we will be ready." Days passed. The riders stayed. They weren't invaders. They were guardians, keeping watch from the hills, patrolling the land in silence. Malachi's ranch, once a forgotten patch of dust and timber, had become the heart of something larger, a symbol of defiance against the men who used law like a whip and gold like shackles. But the storm Jonah promised was real. Malachi felt it in every rider who came to town whispering about bounties, in every stranger at the saloon who asked too many questions, in the letters tacked up by so-called marshals offering rewards for Elena Kane, dead or alive. Every man in the territory seemed to smell blood in the water, and Malachi knew what it meant. His solitude was gone. He could no longer live in the cracks of the world, unseen. By saving a girl in the desert, he had painted a target on his chest. One evening, Elena sat on the porch beside him. She hadn't worn the wedding dress in days. Instead, she dressed in plain work clothes borrowed from Mrs. Crane. Her eyes were hollow but fierce, fire where once there had only been fear. "You should let me go," she said quietly. Malachi didn't answer. "If I leave, maybe they'll stop hunting you. Maybe they'll take me back and it'll end here." Malachi turned to her, his face carved from stone. "You think walking back into hell will put out the fire? No. Kane will keep selling. Blackwood's men will keep buying, and your sister will rot in chains. You leave, you don't end it. You just give them another victory." Her lip trembled, but she didn't look away. "Then what do we do?" Malachi looked at the horizon, where 500 riders sat like shadows waiting for dawn. "We make a stand." The words tasted like iron. He had avoided war his whole life. But some wars don't ask permission. They come for you, whether you're ready or not. The night before the attack, Malachi walked the camp. Warriors sharpened blades, whispered prayers to the fire, painted their faces with ash. He moved among them like a ghost, an outsider and yet something more. They nodded to him, not as a stranger now, but as a man tied to their fate. At the edge of camp, Ahioka sat with her father. She saw Malachi and smiled weakly, the kind of smile that carried more weight than any gift. He had given her life, and now she gave him something back. Belonging. For the first time in years, Malachi didn't feel like a loner. He felt like a man standing where he was meant to stand. Dawn broke, And with it, the horizon filled once more. Not Apache riders this time, but men in dusters, hired guns with polished rifles, bounty hunters, lawmen with papers signed by crooked hands. They came like locusts, swarming the desert, their greed dressed in the cloak of justice. Malachi stood at the front of the line, 500 warriors at his back. Elena beside him, Mrs. Crane on the porch with her shotgun steady. The West had always been a place where men measured themselves in blood. And today, blood would be spilled. Malachi didn't draw yet. He just breathed, steady and calm, his voice low so only those closest heard. "We don't run. Not today. Not ever again." And as the riders thundered closer, Malachi Brooks knew the truth. A loner no more, his name would be written in fire and dust. Because sometimes the West doesn't choose heroes, sometimes it makes them. This was the story of a rancher who fed the hungry, saved the lost, and found himself standing at the center of a war he never wanted. It's a tale of mercy turning into loyalty, of silence broken by 500 riders at dawn. A story of power, greed, blood, and redemption. If this story gripped you, share it with someone who loves the legends of the West, and remember, the smallest act of kindness can echo louder than gunfire and change the course of history.